Hello and welcome back to the Jem Hawkes YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today, no matter what it is you're doing. For our free wire tutorial today here on YouTube, I'd like to share with you the infinity cross design. Now this can be created either very simply in a single gauge of slightly heavier wire, or you can add on a second lighter gauge of wire and some small beads to accentuate the design. If you'd like to join me down at the board now, I'll show you the design we're going to work on together today. So both of the samples I have for you today are crafted in 1mm or 18 gauge wire. In this instance is a rose gold colourway. And I've added some 4mm rondelles to the slightly smaller variation and a singular larger 6mm bicolour crystal up at the top. These are absolutely optional. You can go for a very simplistic design if you prefer. Let's pop one of those over there. In the second design, I added on very tiny seed beads, which if you know me is not something that I tend to work with, but it does work very well when you're looking to add a little bit of subtle definition to a simplistic design. So I'm going to move the wooden plinth out of the way, and we're going to have a look at creating this design together. We're going to start off by making the simplistic version, and then I'll show you how to add on beads if you wish to. I think I'm going to move those out of the way because I'm working with quite a long piece of wire. So this is around about 18 inches of 1mm or 18 gauge wire. The best tool to work with for this is actually bail makers, whether it's the 4 and 6mm 2-prong bail makers, or if you have the 6-step bail makers as I'm working with today. These are really useful tools, and no matter how much wire working you do, they're really handy to have. If you don't have one of those, then the widest part of your round nose pliers will suffice in a pinch. My preference would also be you could perhaps work with a round form such as a pen, but it is just a little bit trickier to get that to sit in position. So we're looking, as I say, at around 18 inches of wire, and we want to start right in the centre of that wire. So we're going to start by warming the central couple of inches just to get some nice fluidity and smoothness in the wire here. And then I'm going to pick which of the sizes on my bail makers I'm going to work with. I think probably we're going to work with the 3rd step today, which looks to be around about 5 or 6mm. I don't know exactly what it is. My verniers are not working. So if I pop the round form, in this instance my multi-step bail makers, into the centre of that wire and just fold both ends of those wires around. Now this is the time when it will absolutely catch the camera or catch things that are on the desk, so do watch out if you've got things around you. And what we're looking to do is to define the size of the form. So I've decided that the lowest portion of the design is going to be about this long. So the ideal is to make sure that those are nice and smooth and even. You can see that it's flaring out a little bit on the one side there. So to fix that, I'm going to put the whole thing back on at those bail makers, close it up, and then open that back out from both sides. And what you'll see is you get much flatter sides and a little bit more definition just there. So if that's the length of the bottom section set, let me just grab one of those pieces. I'm going to go for one that's slightly smaller than the largest of my 2 examples. So this is the size that we're currently looking at, and that's going to define the size of the rest of the project. So let me pop that back out of the way so it doesn't go on the floor. We're now going to make right angle bends at this crossover point up at the top here. So I'm putting the pliers from underneath over the wire that's on the right hand side of the form, where I would be if they stayed put, and I'm just going to pinch that quite firmly at the point where they cross over and put a nice, not quite right angle bend just over towards the left. I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side now. So now we have a point at which the angle looks to take place. We need to replicate that on the second side. So if I put that back into its final orientation and just tilt that in the light, you'll see what we're looking to do is to create an angle going in the opposite direction. Now these curled round bits will try to attack your hands or beads and things that you have on the desk, so do watch out for that if you possibly can. The next thing we're going to do is have a look at the angles coming out at the shoulders of the design. Now if you imagine that there's a straight line running from that nexus point to the central point down at the base here, let me just grab a piece of scrap wire. be helpful if it's a straight piece. And there we go. So if you imagine there is a line running through here, the angle that is created from that nexus point to come out, to swirl around at that round section at the bottom, is the same angle that we're looking to create at 90 degrees opposition. So these look like they're going a little bit too high up at the moment. So I'm just going to bring those down ever so slightly. And again, I'm trying to keep a sense of symmetry at this point. Now, if you do accidentally mash those bends up at the top, you can give that a little bit of a straighten out. We're looking for reasonable, just arcing sections here, but reasonably straight. So we then need to grab our stepped bail makers back in, and we were working with step number 3 today. And what we're going to do is imagine that the right hand bend coming over the top needs to go around towards the base of the design and then back across the nexus point. So I'm going to put step number 3 into position underneath that wire and draw the tail of the wire all the way around and across. So that needs to be reasonably straight again. So I'm just using the thumb to get a little bit of straightness. Now you'll see what I've done here is this section out towards the right looks overly long to me. The idea is to have a definitive difference between the side bars and the lowest bar. The upper bar needs to be just slightly longer than the 2 side bars to just get that really elegant symmetry. So let's pop that back out, and I'll show you how to fix this if you don't have the perfect distance. You can of course do some maths if you want to, and then you can use a tape measure. But as ever, I'm winging it. So I'm going to put those pliers back in and roll the design around until that end section visually looks to be about 2/3 of the distance between the lowest section and the nexus point in the middle. So I think a little bit more even would be helpful at this stage. So I'm just going to rotate that around using my round form. That looks to be good to me. So I'm going to pop that round form back into position, and I'm just going to put some heat into the wire as I coerce a straight line out of the tail of wire so that it will then cross over that nexus point again. So if I pop that down on the board, that's probably just a little bit more than 2/3, but I like that. That's aesthetically pleasing to me. So if I just push that down onto the board for a second, what we're going to do now is the same on the other side. So we'll need to bring the 3rd peg on my bail makers underneath and then rotate the tail of wire around. And to make the design secure, I'm going to take this tail of wire underneath. So I've got one tail coming over the top, the other tail will be going underneath. And whether or not you decide to add beads into that, it just adds a little bit of strength to the design. Now, because I'm right dominant, I'm going to have to turn this over. So I was just saying that we needed to put the number 3 bail underneath. Technically that's still true, but visually not quite so much. So I'm going to rotate the wire around. Again, I'm taking the tail of the wire underneath, and I might just see if I can scooch that around so that it looks around about the same dimension. Now you of course have the opportunity to measure those to make sure they are the same distance. I think I'm going to make that just a tiny bit shorter just by rotating the wire around on the peg and then straightening up the tail wire as it crosses on the back. So if I bring that back into position, you'll see that we're almost there with the basic level of design. So having bent chain nose pliers is a real help for me to design, because it means I can pop those pliers just underneath on the wire that crosses at the back, and I'm going to turn that into a not quite upright. So again, I'm looking to replicate the angle that the original loop is formed down at the base. So you can make that tighter if you need to and then open it back out. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing but on the top wire. So I'm going to pinch that as firmly as I can. I've probably marked the wire now. You won't have to worry about holding it still for camera. So I'm just going to give that wire a little bit of a mend. Just going to push the coating back over the bit where I nicked it. It's rose gold on top of silver on top of copper. And what I might do is just add some beads there later. If it was being made for a commission, I would absolutely restart the project. I'm going to push the wire over like so, until the angle is replicated as it is on the far side. So I'm just going to use my thumb to put some heat up at the top section. And again, I would say this needs to be just a tiny bit longer than the sidebars. Little bit of heat just up at the top there, so that I can now bring in those bail making pliers again and pop number 3. I'm going to start over on the wire on the right hand side. And what I'm going to do is take that all the way over sharply. If you made it too short, you can rotate in the opposite direction. And then I'm going to do the left hand side wire. So I'm going to pop that onto number 3, and then you can either pull the wire over or you can rotate that around, whichever suits you best. Now obviously it's trickier because I have to make sure that I'm not hitting the camera and there's a finite space to work with. So if that looked really difficult, it isn't difficult. I'm making it difficult by the position of my camera. I just want you to be able to see everything. So now we have the basic shape of your infinity cross. I'm going to show you how to just close that up at the top in the most simplistic way. So if I pinch the assembly in the centre, what I want to do is make sure that I'm happy with all the angles. So I think this side on the left here is ever so slightly broader than the one on the right. So I'm just going to open out the one on the right. So if I come back down to that nexus bend and just open that out slightly, that should solve my problem. And then I can bring those bail makers back in if I need to, just to fix up any angles that I may have skewed. You may even want to do that 2 at a time and just draw that around. You can of course always manually edit any of those lines with the flat faces of your pliers. So I'm a little bit happier with that. What I need to do now is choose one of these wires to become an upright and the other wire to just tie around the upright. Now at this point, both of my tail wires are very, very long. They're also of equivalent length. If you have one wire which is very, very short, that should be the wire that wraps around the upright, and the longer of your 2 wires should be the one that becomes the upright. So I'm going to decide that this one is going to become my upright, and before I do that I'm just going to make any final little tiny edits to the shape of that wire, very, very subtly, just making myself a little bit happier with that curve up at the top. And then what I'm going to do is to hold the wire. I'm just going to push the second wire out of the way, and this needs to be halfway across before I turn a right angle up. So you can see that the bend I've made is coming up at the 12 o'clock position, and it's around about halfway across that form up at the top. The left hand wire is going to become the wraparound wire. So what I'm going to do here is just warm that ever so slightly and trim it away. Now there are lots of clever things that you could do here. If you wanted to, you could leave this tail long, you could wrap around a couple of times and add a bead, and then add a little flourish around the bead. However, if you're going for a very simplistic design, all we will do is wrap twice around that core wire. So what I'm going to do is to support that crossing wire underneath. If I lift the wire up at the top, you'll see I'm supporting it at the point it crosses behind the upright, so that I can push a very sharp upright bend on that wire, so that that will sit in position around that upright bend. So what I need to do now is to ensure that none of these angles are changed by my wrapping of this tail wire. So one of the ways that you can do this is to support the top of the cross section. It's even easier if I hold the pliers thusly. I'm supporting the cross section, firmly clenching it between the faces of my pliers and drawing that tail around. And I'm just going to do that one time. And at this stage you could very easily just trim that away and you have a very, very simple cross design. Let me just grab one of the examples. So here it's just 1.5 times wrapping around up at the top. What I've done with this design is added on a single bead but no flourish of wire. I think what I'm going to do is show you how to add on a flourish of wire just in case you want to. And I have a bead to hand, but I didn't, rather foolishly, check to see if it would go on my 1mm 18 gauge wire. I think that it will. If you wanted to, you could very simply cut away the tail of wire at this point and reserve a very, very simplistic and beautifully elegant design. So I'm just going to make sure that I'm happy with how that is sitting up at the top. I'm going to grip the side of the wire here whilst I bring the tail over a couple more times, or at least one more time. So I'm going to grip hold of that one side and draw the tail over the top. Much easier to do when you don't have things in the way, and just tidy that up. Now again, you could simply take this wire to the back and cut it and you'd have a very simple, elegant design. What I'm going to do is draw the wire all the way, the core wire that sits up at the top here, and I'm going to add a bead on. Now you don't have to have a flourish around this at all, I just think it's a nice touch. So I'm going to take the wire from the front where it's coiling around, I'm just going to give that a quick squish to tighten that up so it's really neat and tidy. I'm going to smooth some heat into that wire. It's coming over the top of my core wire. Bring the bead into position, take the tail all the way around underneath that core, like so, and then just finish off with 2 little wraps. So I'm going to pull that into position, finish off at the back. If you didn't want a bead here, or if you were going to stop at this position, flip the design over, pretend there's no bead there, and all you will do when you're finished tying the side wire to the upright is just trim away carefully at the back, and then just give that a nice little squish and a squeeze. Up at the top, a very simple wrapped loop. Now you could go for something a bit more fancy if you wanted to, or you could draw that second wire into making a much fancier bail. All I'm going to do is put a forwards angle on that design. I'm going to use a slightly smaller pin on my multi-step bail makers to create a very simple round loop, like so. So that's a slightly oval form that I've used by taking the bail makers further away from that first bend. You could make a perfectly round loop if you wanted to. And I'm just going to take that tail around once, get that to sit down into position, and fill that little header section of wire, draw it across to the back, and again we're simply going to trim away and squish down. So that 18 inches of wire has left us with a cross that is around about 3 inches in height and plenty to spare. So I'm just going to make sure that that last little bit of wire tail is flat and smooth and snuggled into a gap at the back. And that is your simple form infinity cross all made. So that's the simple and elegant variation of the infinity cross all done and dusted. What I'd like to show you now though is a very simple way of adding just a tad more definition if that is what you want to achieve. If you'd like to join me back down at the board, I'll talk you through the materials and also show you how to just add on those beads. So I have a scrap section here of 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire. If you wanted to add beads all the way down one side on a cross that is around about 3 inches high, I would say perhaps use a good 12 to 18 inches of that finer gauge wire to ensure you have enough to take you all the way down the design. However, I had this scrap in my pot and I am not very good at threading on teeny tiny beads, so I'm not going to do terribly many. What I want to do is show you how you can add some detail to this elegant design. So I'm taking one cut end of my finer gauge wire and I'm going to wrap that 3 times around. I like to see it on the right hand side, maybe that's because I'm right dominant, but that's where we're going to start. So I'm going to just use my pliers to help me get those first couple of wraps into position. I'm going to make them super neat and tidy. I'm going to trim away any excess that I have at the back. If you preferred, you could just take that all the way up to the top and make sure that you have no wastage. You'll also get a really good grip on that wire. If you find that you don't have enough wire over the top to give you those 3 good wraps, you can rotate that coil around, and I'll show you that now. Just as a useful little thing to do. Sometimes you want to have a little bit more captured up at the top. So all I'm doing is I'm allowing my thumb on my non-dominant hand to control the travel of the wire, but I'm not using a huge amount of force. And hopefully what you'll be able to see is that the number of coils up at the top there are growing. We've got about 5 or 6 coils now, I wasn't really counting. I'm just going to tidy those up to make sure that they're super neat and tidy. The benefit of having a few extra coils up at the top here is that if I push that all the way over, it looks quite pretty up at that joint where we created the design's security. So if you want to add on larger beads or seed beads, you absolutely can. Let me just get the two examples for a moment. So these are 4mm rondelles, and these are teeny tiny seed beads. I have no idea what they are. They're probably about 1.5, maybe not even that, maybe just a smidge over 1mm. I'm not really au fait with seed beads. Tiny, tiny beads, and there are many of them. So the cut end of my wire, again, if you wanted to fill this all the way down, I would say probably up to about 18 inches would be smart. I'm going to add on the first of my seed beads onto the end of the wire and allow that to zip line down into position so that it sits smartly against that lovely swooping arc up at the top. So I'm going to pinch the bead in position against the wire that we're working with right now, and I'm going to take the tail of the wire all the way up inside that form and just pull that really firmly into position. Now when you're working with glass beads, you need to be delicate but firm. What I mean by that is, don't pull so hard that your bead shatters, but don't leave it baggy. So don't leave the wire baggy, rather, so that the bead can move around in wear. When you are working with wire, unless you're designing movement into the design, having movement in small beads on wire could wear that out. So I'm going to circle 3 times around this section of the frame. So I'm going to bring that end up inside again, inside the form, and then I'm going to pull that all the way around. So I've got 3 wraps now between the last bead and this segment. So I'm going to add on a second bead, and I'll probably call it quits there because the first one went on really easily, as did that one, and I don't really want to push my luck. Seed beads and me, not so much. So the best way to get these to sit neatly is just to scooch them up with your nail, especially if they're glass. I wouldn't be using tools. Hold that bead into position against the frame. Take the tail up inside the frame. So you're coming from the top of the wire over the top, all the way around the outside. If you prefer, you can push the leading edge of that wire through in a D shape. Now it will wear the wire whichever way you operate this. So you could possibly go up to a slightly heavier wire, say a 24 gauge or 0.5mm wire. That's absolutely possible, but my preference is to work with the 26 gauge and just get the tension nice and neat and tidy. So all you would need to do from there on is continue down. When you get to the point where all of those wires cross over, all you will need to do is finish off with a bead, wrap 3 times around the core, and then pass over the back of the design from one side to the other, and start again on the wire down here. Now, of course, in my examples, I have gone for the right side and the right side. You could go from the right side to the left side. It's absolutely up to you how you choose to finish the design off, whether you leave it with no beads on whatsoever, or whether you add beads, or whether you add beads all the way around. It's absolutely up to you. Obviously, you'll need slightly more wire, and you may wish to do that in segments anyway. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed today's tutorial. Have yourself a very beautiful day, and I look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. I'm Jem Hawkes. Bye for now.